It started like every other hearing on Capitol Hill: chairs scraping the floor, scripted outrage, and sound bites built for cable news. But when Chip Roy stood up and accused the Biden administration of building electric vehicles on the backs of Congolese child laborers, the room went still. It was the kind of speech designed to stir moral panic, to wave the flag while hiding the smoke. But this time, it didn't go unchecked, because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't just clap back. She exposed what was really happening, not with noise, with clarity, not with emotion, with evidence. And when she peeled back the curtain on who actually benefits from deregulated mining, foreign-owned land grabs, and weaponized compassion, America listened. This story is a dramatization inspired by real congressional moments. While the events are fictionalized for narrative impact, every emotional truth about power, hypocrisy, and the price of silence is deeply rooted in the world we all share. So buckle up. This isn't just politics. This is the story of a microphone, a mask, and the woman who tore it off. The overhead lights in the congressional hearing room buzzed faintly, as if even the electricity itself knew better than to interrupt what was about to unfold. A pair of double oak doors creaked open at the back, and the quiet murmur of side conversations flickered out like candles in a sudden wind. Cameramen leaned in closer. Phones slid quietly into pockets. Even the aides, usually half distracted by texts and talking points, paused mid-scroll. All eyes moved to the front. Bang! The sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the room, ricocheting off the marble columns like the first drumbeat of a coming storm. "The committee will come to order," the chairwoman announced, her voice neutral, but her eyes betraying the anticipation everyone felt. This wasn't just another hearing. There was something in the air today, something coiled, like a rope about to snap, like a truth about to escape. 3 seats from the center, Congressman Chip Roy straightened in his chair, already adjusting the mic even before his name was called. His fingers drummed once on the table. Habit, not nerves. He looked like a man about to charge the field, not ask a question. Navy suit, Texas lapel pin, and those unmistakable scuffed cowboy boots peeking from beneath the table. More symbolic than practical in this room of polished leather shoes. "Madam Chair," he said, almost casually, "if I may?" The chair nodded. "The gentleman from Texas is recognized." Roy leaned forward. A small red light blinked to life on his microphone. But just before he spoke, the camera, broadcasting live to millions, panned slowly across the dais, capturing the contrasting figure seated just 2 chairs down. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Still, silent, composed. She wasn't scrolling. She wasn't whispering to aides. She simply watched, wearing a charcoal gray blazer and no jewelry, but a small pin on her lapel that read "Unbought." No one could miss the contrast. Where Roy radiated a kind of aggressive charisma, AOC exuded something colder, sharper, like the calm just before a scalpel cuts. And while Roy's boots told a story of grit and gravel roads, AOC's presence whispered of another kind of survival. Concrete playgrounds, subway grit, and the discipline it takes to be underestimated daily and still show up ready. The difference between them wasn't just political, it was philosophical. 2 Americas, 1 table, and they were about to collide. Roy cleared his throat. The sound was picked up by every mic, broadcast into every corner of the chamber, and piped into waiting rooms, kitchens, classrooms. He smirked, just slightly. "Madam Chair, I want to speak, briefly of course, about a matter I'm sure concerns us all: child slavery. Specifically, the kind fueling electric vehicles under this administration's disastrous mandates." Aides' heads snapped up. "What?" AOC didn't blink. "Now, I understand some folks here would prefer to talk about the climate," Roy continued, his tone oiled with righteousness. "But I'd like to ask my colleagues if they're willing to admit, on the record, that the batteries in those electric vehicles are mined with the blood of children in the Congo." Gasps, murmurs. A reporter in the back dropped their pen. Roy paused for effect. He scanned the room with the confidence of a man who believed no one would dare challenge him on something this moral. But the camera had already swung back. AOC hadn't moved. Not a flinch. Not a shift. Just the faintest narrowing of the eyes. Somewhere in the corner of the room, a young staffer mouthed, "Oh no, he just did that." The gavel hadn't moved again, but in that moment, the chamber held its breath, because everyone in the room knew something they couldn't quite explain. This wasn't just going to be a debate. This was going to be a reckoning. The moment Chip Roy began to speak, the room shifted. Not physically, but atmospherically. It was the tone, the performative pause between sentences, the slow sharpening of every word like a blade being dragged across a whetstone. He wasn't asking a question. He was building a trap, and everyone in the room knew it. "I'm just going to say it," he began, eyes flicking toward the cameras before locking in on the panel. "We're being sold a fantasy, a utopia with zero tailpipe emissions and zero fossil fuels, where everyone in this country is expected to drive an electric car, whether they can afford it or not." He leaned in, resting his elbows on the polished wood table, as if he were confiding in the American people directly. "But here's what they won't tell you," he continued, voice tightening. "Those batteries, the ones that power the Teslas, the Bolts, the so-called future, they don't come from some magic green factory. They come from the Congo, from cobalt mines so deep and so dark, even sunlight doesn't reach, from slave-mined minerals pulled out of the ground by children, little boys with no boots, little girls with no gloves, digging with their bare hands for just enough to stay alive another day." He let that hang. "You want to talk about climate justice?" he said, sitting back. "Let's talk about blood-stained batteries. Let's talk about how the same people who claim to fight for human rights are pushing a policy that depends on child laborers in a war-torn nation. Let's talk about how China has its foot on our throat, controlling over 80% of cobalt supply, and we're just letting it happen." He reached for a sheet of paper, waved it briefly in the air like some holy writ. "This administration's mandate that 2/3 of all vehicles must be electric by 2030, that's not just bad economics. That's moral bankruptcy. Because who do you think is going to suffer under that kind of pressure? The families in my district sure aren't buying new EVs every 5 years. The plumber in San Marcos, Texas? He's not worried about his carbon footprint. He's worried about feeding his kids. But instead of helping him afford a reliable gas-powered truck, we're telling him the future is a battery built by a child 5,000 miles away." His voice grew louder, not angry, but theatrically so. Controlled indignation, seasoned for the soundbite. "And while our working-class Americans are forced to make impossible choices, China's building coal plants at a rate of 1 every 5 days to refine the minerals we pretend are clean. Let me say that again. Coal-fired power plants, just to manufacture your clean green technology." He looked down at his notes, then back up, face solemn now. "I don't care what side of the aisle you sit on. I don't care what the climate models say. If your plan to save the planet starts with enslaved children and ends with American families priced out of mobility, then it's not a plan. It's a lie." For a moment there was quiet, not because he'd said something profound, but because he'd said something designed to be unanswerable. Weaponized compassion, calculated outrage, and the worst part? It almost worked. The room held still, waiting to see who would bite. Who would dare challenge a man who just wrapped fossil fuel defense in the suffering of children? But 2 seats down, AOC sat unmoved, the gears in her mind turning, not in fear but in precision, because she wasn't just preparing to respond, she was preparing to reveal, and Chip Roy had no idea what was coming. She didn't flinch, not when he said blood-stained batteries, not when he waved the paper like a verdict, not even when he dropped the word enslaved with that pointed pause he used when he wanted it to land like thunder. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez just sat still, her hands folded loosely in front of her, eyes steady, not on Chip Roy but through him. She'd heard this play before. Different committee, different topic, same formula. Dress up a systemic problem in moral language, make yourself the hero, and then use that theater to stall real progress. It was never about children in the Congo. It was never about plumbers in Texas. It was about protecting the same power structures that had failed both. She knew it, and he knew she knew it. That's why he never looked directly at her. Across the table, one of her aides shifted slightly in their chair, my eyes flicking toward her. Another leaned in, whispering, "He's playing it big." She didn't respond, didn't nod. Her posture remained calm, but something behind her eyes had changed. just enough for anyone paying attention to feel it. Like the quiet heaviness in the air right before a summer storm cracks the sky wide open. Because this time, she wasn't going to let it slide. She'd sat through enough hearings where bad faith arguments were paraded around like gospel, where human suffering was twisted into a weapon against environmental reform, where working class struggles were suddenly important, so long as they could be used to punch down on climate action, labor rights, immigration reform. She had held her tongue through half-truths, selective outrage, and those long, winding speeches designed to sound like concern, but built like shields. But this time was different. This one hit something deeper. It wasn't just the audacity of invoking child labor while defending deregulated mining. It was the silence after. The way some in the room had started nodding. The way the camera lingered on Roy like he'd just delivered a mic drop moment. The way they always assumed her side of the aisle would absorb the blow, stay above it, move on. But silence had a cost, and in that moment, she felt every inch of it. She thought about the community health clinic back in the Bronx, the one built near the abandoned battery plant that was supposed to bring clean energy jobs, and left behind nothing but lawsuits and soil warnings. She thought about the little girl with asthma who came in coughing through every season. She thought about all the kids caught in supply chains, from Congo to Queens, who were never more than a bullet point in someone else's speech. No, not this time. Without saying a word, AOC uncrossed her hands, adjusted the single pin on her lapel, and let her breath settle into something measured. Then slowly, purposefully, she stood. The chair made only a soft scrape across the floor, but it was enough. Heads turned. Staffers sat up. Even the cameras seemed to anticipate what was coming. "Madam Chair," she said, voice low but clear, "I'd like to respond." And just like that, the room, once again, held its breath. "Don't we care about child slaves?" Chip Roy repeated, this time louder, almost daring the room to contradict him. "Don't we care about American workers?" He leaned into the rhetorical weight of those words like a preacher leaning over the pulpit, conviction swelling in his voice. The hearing room, tight, paneled, and too bright under the recessed lights, seemed to lean with him. Several heads nodded. Some members from his side of the aisle even muttered soft mm-hms under their breath, affirming his indignation like a congregation. He wasn't just giving testimony now. He was performing righteousness, and he was doing it well. Roy tapped his folder with deliberate rhythm, making eye contact with every face that dared look up. "I'm not here to score points," he claimed, even as he delivered the sentence with the exact cadence of a headline. "I'm here to ask the hard questions. Who benefits when we ignore where this cobalt comes from? Who profits when we pretend that lithium just materializes out of clean air?" He pulled a paper from his folder, brandishing it with the flourish of someone convinced that numbers, when wrapped in outrage, can't be argued with. 80% of the global cobalt supply comes from the Congo. 70% of that is controlled by Chinese interests. And you know what that means? That means that every single electric vehicle pushed onto the American people through these tailpipe mandates comes with a price, a human price. His voice cracked, right on cue. He wasn't angry. Not really. He was polished, rehearsed, well-timed. And that was what made him dangerous. He wrapped obstruction in empathy, wrapped delay in dignity, and each line was crafted not just to make a point, but to corner anyone who disagreed into looking heartless, disconnected, or worse, complicit. Alexandria sat still, her expression unchanged, though her fingers flexed subtly against her notepad. She wasn't surprised. Roy was good. Too good. He made it sound like opposing his narrative meant approving of suffering, as if the only two options were, let American industry plunder federal lands, or let Congolese children die. No third path, no nuance, just a binary laced with moral shame. And now the room was nodding with him. One member leaned toward another and whispered something that made them both chuckle lightly. Another checked their notes, perhaps mentally aligning with Roy's numbers. Even the chairwoman, though neutral, adjusted her posture as if absorbing the shift in atmosphere. He was painting himself as the protector of the voiceless, the underdog standing up for workers and children alike, all while pointing a finger at the so-called elite environmentalists who, in his version of the story, had never set foot outside their coastal comfort zones, And the worst part was, it was working. For now. I've seen the pictures, Roy continued, softening slightly. I've seen 10-year-olds carrying sacks of ore heavier than their own bodies. I've read the reports that say they die in tunnels, collapsed lungs, crushed bones. Also, some rich bureaucrat can drive a shiny new EV and pat themselves on the back while outsourcing guilt to another continent. He took a breath, let the silence linger. I'm not saying don't care about the planet. I'm saying we should start by caring about the people on it. That includes our workers. That includes our kids. That includes the kids in the Congo. There it was again, that tone, moral clarity on the surface, and underneath, a tightly coded message. Delay progress, undermine transition, protect profit, but cloak it in compassion, and people would follow. Alexandria kept her eyes on him. Still no flinch, no blink, just focus. Because while Roy played to the room, she was preparing to speak to the country. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It cut through the thick air like a scalpel sliding through silk, quiet, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. It's always interesting, AOC began, her tone even, how concern for child labor seems to appear, only when green energy is on the table. She didn't look at Chip Roy when she said it. She looked at the room, at the people, at the faces that just moments ago had been nodding in unison, not to provoke, not to shame, but to peel something back, something uncomfortable, something they all knew but rarely said aloud. We've had child labor in textiles, in agriculture, in domestic supply chains for decades, but somehow the only time it gets a national airtime, gets wielded like a weapon, is when it can be used to stop environmental progress. She let that sink in. Then she leaned slightly forward, her voice still controlled, but layered now with purpose. Let's be clear, child labor in cobalt mining is a crisis, a moral one. But if you only care when it's politically convenient, then you're not defending children. You're defending status quo. That was when she finally turned toward Roy. And while we're on the subject of convenience, let's talk about whose convenience we're really protecting. She pulled a printed page from her folder and laid it flat on the table. This is the corporate structure of a foreign mining company operating right now on American soil, on land leased through legislative backdoors created by bills you supported. Now her voice sharpened, the edge of steel just visible beneath the surface. These aren't American-owned companies. These are subsidiaries, many based in the Cayman Islands, others with ties to state-controlled Chinese firms. And they've been handed access to U.S. mineral reserves through deregulation packages passed under the guise of energy independence. Packages you championed. The murmuring started again, soft but undeniable. You talk about foreign dependence, she continued, but the truth is, the very policies you push allow Chinese firms to extract resources here, ship them abroad, and sell them back to us, while we call it domestic production. She wasn't speaking in sound bites. She was building a case. You're concerned about who controls cobalt? So am I. But I'm also concerned about who owns the leases, who profits, and who's held accountable when that mining poisons American water or desecrates sacred land. Another paper slid across the table, this one highlighting the Twin Metals mine proposal. This project, also backed through deregulatory support, would send the majority of its materials overseas, for smelting, for refinement, for resale. So tell me, how does that strengthen our sovereignty? The pause that followed wasn't silent, it was weighted. It doesn't, she said flatly. It consolidates power, it privatizes profit, and it leaves our communities with the waste. She knew the risk of saying it like this. The room wasn't used to hearing power talked about in terms of patterns. They wanted to believe these moments were isolated. That deregulation was patriotic. That foreign exploitation only existed elsewhere. But she had no intention of letting them stay comfortable. If we're serious about ending child labor, about protecting American workers, then let's do that. But let's start by stopping the loopholes that allow foreign companies to operate like ghosts on American land. Let's start by investing in recycling infrastructure, ethical labor standards, and real accountability. Not just speeches. She set her notes aside, looked up. Because if your outrage only begins where green energy starts, then it's not about morality, it's about obstruction, and I won't pretend otherwise. No applause, no rebuttal, just that silence again. But this time, it wasn't agreement with Roy that filled it. It was the weight of a story they'd never quite been forced to hear in full, until now. By the time she finished speaking, the room had shifted again. But this time, it didn't tilt toward Chip Roy. It settled into something quieter, heavier. Not the silence of agreement, but the silence of recognition. The kind that comes when people hear something they weren't ready for, but can't unhear. The cameras, positioned like quiet sentinels in the corners of the room, didn't blink. They never did. But suddenly everyone else was. Roy didn't respond immediately. He looked down at his notes as if trying to find his place, but his hand paused, hovering. The papers didn't hold the answer. Not to this. He hadn't expected her to come back like that. Clean, calm, without raising her voice, and yet cutting clean through the story he thought he controlled. It wasn't that she called him a liar. She didn't have to. She just showed the structure, exposed the mechanisms, held up the diagram of how moral panic is built, and who builds it. In the back of the room, a few journalists leaned toward each other. One muttered something that ended in a sharp inhale. Another typed fast into a phone. Already the ripple had begun. On CSPAN's live feed, the comment stream lit up in real time. She came with receipts. Wait, did she just link Chinese subsidies to Roy's bill? This wasn't a clapback. This was an autopsy. Somebody get this woman a chalkboard and a primetime slot. Viewers who had tuned in expecting a standard policy skirmish now found themselves watching something else entirely. A moral chess match, one where every move exposed more of the board. And unlike most political theater, this wasn't showmanship for applause. This was strategy for accountability. Roy tried to reset. With all due respect to the gentlewoman, he began, but the words came slower now. Not hesitating, he wasn't the type, but no longer riding that confident wave of momentum he'd had just 15 minutes earlier. I think we can all agree that transparency is important, but he stopped. That was the tell. There was no clean pivot, no discrediting her facts without looking petty, no smirking rebuttal without looking rattled. AOC didn't respond. Not yet. She didn't need to, because this moment wasn't about argument. It was about exposure. The light was on. Let it stay on. She glanced toward the hearing room clock, not to stall, but to ground herself. The moment was hot, she could feel it in her chest, but discipline mattered. Let him speak. Let him flail in formal phrases and abstract sentiments. The truth had already been named, and once it's out loud, it doesn't go quietly back into the dark. One aide passed a note behind her, a simple one-word scribble, trending. She nodded without looking. It wasn't pride. It wasn't gotcha. It was clarity. For once, the argument wasn't being framed around fear or urgency or rural nostalgia. It was being framed around facts with a spine, and the cameras, merciless as ever, kept rolling. They didn't blink. But Roy did, just once, then twice. Not enough to make headlines, but enough to prove something had landed. And AOC, quiet, steady, surgical, was already preparing her next move. Chip Roy regrouped quickly. That was one thing she had to give him. He didn't waste time licking wounds. He pivoted not by engaging her point, but by reaching for the next tool in the rhetorical drawer. Deflection laced with populism. Look, we can sit here all day debating spreadsheets and supply chains, he said, voice gaining volume, trying to reclaim the center of gravity in the room. But I want to bring this back to what really matters. We're not talking about corporations or foreign contracts. We're talking about American jobs, about real people. It was classic. Move the frame. Make it personal, emotional, defensive. If facts aren't on your side, make people feel like their dignity is. Because while some folks here are worried about which multinational company is signing which lease, he continued, gesturing vaguely without naming names, the people I represent are worried about losing their livelihoods, their land, their way of life. She felt it coming before he even said it. The fear play. It always came next. They're coming for your trucks, your gas, your freedom to live the way your parents did and their parents before them. These policies being shoved down our throats from Washington, they're not designed for ordinary Americans. They're written by people who've never changed the oil on their own car, people who've never filled a pickup bed with lumber or driven 40 miles just to buy groceries. Somewhere behind him, a staffer adjusted a tablet screen showing a grainy photo of a dirt road and a gas station with a help wanted sign taped in the window. She could almost hear the script forming: rural authenticity versus urban arrogance. The hard-working man against the elite bureaucrat. It didn't matter that his argument hadn't addressed a single thing she said. That wasn't the point. The point was fog. Make it hazy. Make it feel like you're defending something worth protecting. This isn't just about cobalt. It's not just about EVs, Roy continued, his voice now full sermon. It's about a vision for America where ordinary people get left behind, where policy is decided in clean offices and forced onto dusty farms, where the plumber in San Marcos doesn't just lose his truck, he loses his independence. He paused, letting the imagery settle, almost daring her to interrupt. She didn't, because she recognized what this was: a smoke grenade, not a rebuttal, not a counter-argument, just thick emotional haze meant to choke out reason, obscure the facts, and make any challenge seem cold or out of touch. What Roy was doing was smart in its own way. He wasn't defending child labor. He wasn't denying foreign control of mining. He was shifting the lens, again, and turning himself into the spokesman for the forgotten man, no matter how manufactured the persona. And in that moment, the trap was obvious. If she countered with policy, he'd accuse her of being disconnected. If she responded with facts, he'd say she was heartless. It wasn't a debate he was staging. It was a narrative war. And he knew how to tell a story that made people feel like they were the ones under attack. "So go ahead," he added finally, settling back with a confident nod. "Defend your subsidies. Defend your mandates. But don't look my constituents in the eye and pretend this is about justice. Because what they see is another promise made to Wall Street, paid for by Main Street." More nodding, more phones lighting up. Another wave of agreement rippling through the room. But she wasn't rattled, because she wasn't done. And this time, she wasn't just going to cut through the fog. She was going to name the hand that threw it. She waited for the noise to settle, the not-so-subtle clatter of agreement, the nods of loyalty masquerading as understanding, and the carefully staged outrage that always followed a line like, "They're coming for your way of life." She waited, not out of hesitation, but out of precision, because the next thing she said wasn't going to be loud. It was going to be clear. And clarity, she'd learned, cuts deeper than any performance ever could. Slowly, she reached for a thin folder tucked beneath her binder. It wasn't thick, just a few pages, but it had weight. Not physical weight, narrative weight, the kind that could tilt the entire conversation if used right. She slid one page out and placed it on the desk in front of her, angling it so that others could see. A map, not abstract, not symbolic, just a simple map of the continental U.S., color-coded by county, with bold red dots indicating active or pending leases for critical mineral extraction: lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite. Alongside it, highlighted in yellow, were the registered ownership flags of the companies listed on those leases. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Congressman Roy says he wants to protect America's land," she began. "So let's take a look at who's actually profiting from it." She tapped the corner of the map gently, then slid another sheet forward. These leases, many pushed through after the rollback of public land protections, were approved under legislation marketed as American energy independence. The problem is, when you follow the paper trail, they don't end in Midland or Pittsburgh or Reno. They end in Shanghai, in Shenzhen, in the hands of holding companies buried 3 layers deep behind Delaware LLCs. The room quieted. No retorts yet, just listening. "You say you want to fight China," she continued, finally looking up, locking eyes with Roy for the first time that afternoon. "But here's the truth. You're handing them the shovel." It landed harder than anything she'd said all day. Not because it was emotional, but because it was undeniable. Everyone in that room knew how foreign ownership games were played, how regulatory rollbacks were sold as pro-America, and quietly structured to benefit anyone but the American people. The same companies we deregulate for, she said, holding up a lease document, are using their U.S. subsidiaries to mine American land, export the raw material, refine it abroad, and then sell it back to us at a markup. We call that energy security. They call it business. She paused. Not for effect, but to let the truth settle. You want to protect the plumber in San Marcos? So do I. But that plumber doesn't benefit from a lease signed by a shell company that routes profits offshore. He doesn't benefit from water contamination or decimated farmland. He doesn't benefit from tax breaks handed to firms that'll never hire in his community. What he needs is honest policy, not patriotic branding on foreign profits. There was no sarcasm in her tone, no condescension, only clarity, only facts. If we truly care about sovereignty, about jobs, about the dignity of American labor, then the first thing we need to do is stop pretending. Stop pretending that deregulation equals independence. Stop pretending that every mine built on U.S. land is American-owned. Stop pretending we can wave a flag while turning a blind eye to whose hands are in the ground. She held the map one last time before sliding it back into the folder. Because at some point, if we're not willing to name what's actually happening, then we're not protecting America. We're just protecting the illusion of it. The room didn't move. Cameras stayed trained. And even Chip Roy, for a breath, said nothing. He didn't wait for her to finish the sentence. His voice sliced across the room, sharper now, tighter, with just enough edge to betray what she already suspected. He felt the pressure. With all due respect, Roy snapped, this isn't about foreign paperwork and bureaucratic sleight of hand. This is about protecting real people, American people, from losing their jobs and their lives to your vision of climate utopia. It was the first time the word "your" had come out like a weapon. Before this, he had addressed the left, the administration, the elite. But now it was personal. Director. His tone wasn't just defensive. It was cracking under the weight of a narrative no longer in his control. AOC didn't raise an eyebrow. She just looked at him, calm, steady. But in her mind, she felt the shift. These were the moments she had learned to pay attention to. The ones where noise was mistaken for strength, where certainty blurred into panic. He gestured toward her map, now partially tucked back into her folder. You know what? You can throw maps and charts and corporate filings at the wall all day. That's not going to change what families in my district are living through. And frankly, if we spent half the energy helping Americans as we do making villains out of anyone who doesn't buy into your green agenda, we might actually fix something. There it was again, your green agenda. He said it like it was a dirty phrase, like believing in clean air and responsible mining was somehow a radical luxury. AOC waited for him to settle, for his words to hang in the air just long enough to expose themselves. And then she asked it. Did you vote, she said, her voice low and measured, for the bill that approved a foreign-controlled mining lease 4 miles from Fort Hood? The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was surgical. His mouth opened, closed. A flicker of calculation crossed his face, whether to deny, deflect, or redirect. But it was too late. The question had been asked in front of witnesses, staffers, C-SPAN, and every American watching live. And it had been asked with full awareness of the answer. Because I have the vote record right here, she continued, holding up a slip of paper, not waving it, not dramatic, just visible. House Resolution 2783, passed last year. The amendment that stripped environmental review from a land parcel leased to a joint venture, majority owned by a firm registered in Hong Kong, just a few miles from one of the largest military installations in the country. Roy opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. One of the cameramen in the back instinctively zoomed in. Not for drama, not for effect, just to see. His eyes blinked twice. He looked down at his papers. He began to speak, then stopped. AOC didn't gloat. She didn't need to. I bring it up, she said quietly, because if we're going to talk about who's defending this country, let's not do it with slogans. Let's do it with votes. No one laughed. No one clapped. But something shifted in the room, something subtle but irreversible. A current of awareness. A realization that the man who spoke so loudly about sovereignty had voted to lease land near a U.S. Army base to a foreign mining outfit, then stood here lecturing others about national pride. Roy looked away first. It wasn't collapse, it wasn't confession, but it was the beginning of the unraveling. And for the first time that afternoon, the righteous voice from Texas found himself without a comeback. She didn't look at Roy when she began speaking again. She didn't need to. He was no longer the center of the room. Not after that question, not after the silence that followed it. Instead, she turned slightly, not to the dais but to the space just beyond it, as if speaking to someone who wasn't there, but who mattered more than anyone else in the room. I want to tell you about a girl I met back in the Bronx. She's 12, lives in a housing development 2 blocks from where I grew up. Her name's Jada. The name landed softly, but it carried weight. Not statistics, not legislation. A name, a story. Jada has asthma, bad. Her mom keeps a plastic nebulizer on top of their kitchen fridge, and every time the weather swings hard, like it did last spring, she ends up in the ER. No one interrupted. Even Roy stayed quiet. They live in one of those buildings where the windows don't seal properly, where the walls are the color of old paper, and where the playground fence is missing more slats than it has left. Right behind her apartment is a fenced-off lot. On paper, it's just an abandoned service yard, but ask the neighbors and they'll tell you what it really is. She paused. It's a dumping ground. Old batteries, construction waste, industrial drums nobody's bothered to label. The kids call it the dead yard. They don't play near it, but the wind doesn't care where it carries the dust. A few people shifted in their chairs. This wasn't in any policy packet. It wasn't on any chart. And here's the thing, she continued, voice low but certain. When you grow up breathing air like that, when the smell of chemicals mixes with the sound of traffic outside your bedroom window, you learn something. You learn to recognize danger, not just in your lungs, but in your politics. Her gaze lifted now, not angry, not performative, just steady. You learn to recognize the difference between concern and convenience, between protection and pretense. You learn that sometimes the same people who claim to defend your community have never once stepped foot in it. She let that sit. It wasn't a line, it was a memory. I didn't grow up with hiking trails or preserved wetlands or gated lawns. I grew up with chain-link fences and exhaust fumes, and the constant low-grade awareness that the world around us was never designed for our protection. So when I hear speeches about jobs and freedom, wrapped in just enough empathy to sound noble, I think of Jada. She turned a page in her folder, slowly. Because Jada didn't vote for deregulated mining. She didn't get a say in who dumps waste behind her building. She doesn't get invited to hearings like this, but she still pays the price every time she struggles to breathe. And then gently, so no, this isn't abstract. It's not theoretical. It's not some elite fantasy about clean energy. It's about kids like Jada. It's about how we decide which communities are disposable and which ones are worth protecting. No anger, no blame, just a simple truth. She had lived it. And if you grow up with poison in your air, she said finally, voice quiet now, you learn to recognize political toxins too. There was no response, just silence. Because for a moment, the hearing wasn't about strategy or headlines or positioning. It was about a girl in the Bronx and what this country chooses to see or chooses to ignore. She hadn't meant to think about it in that moment, but as she sat quietly, letting Jada's story linger in the room like incense, it rose up in her memory anyway, her first day on the Hill. The marble floors had echoed with shoes that cost more than her monthly rent back then. Every hallway smelled like polished furniture and expensive aftershave. Staffers glanced at her badge twice, some out of curiosity, others out of confusion. Like they weren't entirely sure she belonged. A few didn't bother to glance at all. She remembered one moment in particular. An older member had passed her in the elevator lobby. He didn't recognize her, didn't pause, just nodded at her and asked, "Press or intern?" She'd smiled politely and said nothing, but inside she filed it away. Not out of bitterness. She didn't have time for that. She filed it because it told her exactly what she was up against. She was 29, brown, from the Bronx, wore her hair in a bun, and carried a canvas tote bag instead of a designer briefcase. And from the moment she arrived, people had decided who she was before she opened her mouth. They mistook quiet for uncertainty, passion for naivety, and district organizing for amateurism. They didn't see a policymaker. They saw a fluke, a headline, a temporary disruption. But that underestimation had turned out to be a gift because it gave her space. Space to observe, to learn the rhythms, to read the faces, to listen more than she spoke. And when she finally did speak, it wasn't with fire, it was with precision. Now, years later, seated in a high-stakes hearing with the weight of communities like hers resting invisibly across her shoulders, she knew exactly what to do with that history. This moment, this clash, wasn't just about policy. It wasn't even about Chip Roy or deregulated mining or cobalt maps or all the talking points that had filled the air for the last 2 hours. It was about something deeper, about memory, survival, and representation. Because while some spoke in abstractions, she spoke in lived experience. While others carried binders, she carried the weight of neighborhoods people still couldn't point to on a map. While others used stats, she used names. And while some defended power, she defended the people who never had it. She adjusted the microphone slightly and leaned forward, not for theatrics, but to close the distance. You know, I didn't run for Congress because I thought politics needed another voice like the ones already in this room, she said softly. I ran because I was tired of watching working people, kids, moms, elders, get talked about like problems to be managed instead of people to be fought for. Her tone stayed steady, but the words deepened. I'm not here just as a member of Congress. I'm here as a big sister, to Jada, to the kids in public schools breathing dirty air, to the families working 2 jobs and still falling behind. And when I speak up in these hearings, it's not for sound bites. It's because I know what it feels like to grow up wondering if anyone up here even knows you exist. A pause, just long enough to breathe. Just long enough to let them hear her heart without her having to raise her voice. So if I seem unyielding, it's because I've seen what yielding costs. And I'm not here to make anyone comfortable. I'm here to make someone visible. She wasn't just making a point anymore. She was making a presence, one they could no longer ignore. She had barely finished her last sentence when Roy leaned forward again, his mic already live, his voice threading into hers before the air could settle. Let's not pretend like this is about who cares more. But she didn't let him finish. Not this time. The room had already heard enough from him, enough manufactured passion, enough polished lines passed off as moral concern. She didn't raise her voice, didn't slam a fist. She didn't need to. Her interruption was quiet, firm, and unshakably clear. I'm not here, she said, eyes locking onto his, to debate your outrage. I'm here to expose your performance. The air in the room compressed. A few staffers stopped typing. Some members looked down. Others looked directly at her, suddenly still. She wasn't angry. She was done pretending his indignation was real. Done watching him use empathy like a prop to block progress. Because she'd seen this act before, again and again. Wrap corporate agendas in concern for children. Frame obstruction as moral clarity. Turn real suffering into rhetorical armor. You say you care about the kids in the Congo, she continued, her tone cutting through the room like a needle through canvas. But where were those speeches when we debated trade deals that let corporations offload environmental devastation onto poor Black and brown communities abroad? Where was that passion when we tried to pass legislation banning U.S. companies from sourcing from mines that use child labor? Roy opened his mouth again, but this time, the pause wasn't waiting for him. It was warning him. No, she said, not louder, but firmer. You don't get to interrupt now. You've had your floor, your camera time, your sound bites. You had your chance to speak for those children, and you chose to wait until their suffering became politically convenient. There was a low rumble in the chamber, a murmur not of disagreement, but of recognition. Empathy isn't a weapon, she said, her voice quieter now, but somehow more forceful. But when it's used to stall progress, to distract, to mislead, then it becomes something far more dangerous. It becomes a shield for power. Someone on the Republican side shifted in their seat but didn't speak. On the Democratic side, A member who'd been silent most of the hearing gave a single, slow nod. The line between sides was beginning to blur, not ideologically, but emotionally. Then a moment no one expected, a single clap. It came from somewhere in the middle row. Then another. And suddenly, the chamber that had sat in near silence for most of the back and forth began to move. It wasn't thunderous. It wasn't theatrical. It was genuine. A ripple of real bipartisan applause, not because someone had won a point, but because something had finally been said that stripped away the noise. She didn't smile. She didn't acknowledge the clapping. This wasn't about performance. It never had been. She simply sat back, notes untouched, pen still capped. For once, the room wasn't debating, it was reflecting. And as the cameras kept rolling and the noise finally paused, she did what Chip Roy never could. She let the silence speak for itself. She knew he wouldn't stay quiet for long. He never did. Moments after the last clap died down, Roy leaned forward again, voice clipped, tone sharpened by the sting of losing control. He didn't mask his irritation this time. He wore it like armor. "Let me be clear," he began, forcing the room's attention back toward him. "What we just heard was a speech, not a strategy. Because while some members here are busy throwing around moral judgments, the rest of us are trying to make sure this country doesn't run out of fuel and common sense." There it was, predictable as ever. He pushed his chair back slightly, voice growing in force as he built up his usual two-option worldview. The fossil fuel playbook never changed. Frame everything as a choice between collapse and control, between foreign dependence and American dominance. "The reality is simple," he continued, holding up a binder now as if its weight made his point more valid. "Either we use the resources we have here at home, oil, gas, coal, or we hand over our energy future to Beijing and child miners in the Congo. There is no third option." He let that hang, confident it would echo. What's being proposed here today isn't a transition. It's a takedown of American energy, a takedown of the jobs that keep rural communities alive, a takedown of our sovereignty. He was leaning hard into it now, talking fast, as if speed could substitute for depth. She watched him closely, not out of concern, but curiosity. He wasn't rebutting. He was retreating into the safety of binaries, where everything could be divided cleanly. Us versus them, jobs versus ideals, survival versus fantasy. "You say we can recycle," Roy went on, addressing her words without ever naming her. "You say we can find ethical sources, but where are they? Who's building them? Because right now, the only thing being built is red tape and federal mandates that strangle American production while giving China more power than ever." And there it was, the final card. China, again, his catch-all justification. If you challenge him, you're soft on China. If you want environmental standards, you're helping China. If you ask for ethical supply chains, you're naive about China. But he never seemed to mention how deregulation had let foreign companies operate with no transparency. Never mentioned the cozy industry ties behind the very bills he defended. Never acknowledged that what he called freedom often meant letting corporations take without giving back. So unless you're ready to tell the American people that they have to choose between a job and a conscience, Roy concluded, maybe we should stop pretending this green fantasy doesn't come with a human cost. She kept her expression still, but inside she could feel the exhaustion of the same circular argument being dressed up again like it was new. The false choice, the forced corner. As if building a future that didn't rely on child exploitation or environmental ruin was somehow impossible. Roy wasn't arguing because he believed there were no other options. He was arguing because he couldn't imagine, or wouldn't allow, a world where more than two options existed. That, she thought, was the real failure of imagination. And in the next moment, she was going to show him exactly what he left out. She didn't respond right away. She let Roy finish his monologue, let every sentence land exactly the way he wanted, wrapped in certainty and sealed with false choices. Then she glanced at the committee chair, just briefly, and turned her mic back on. "I think the congressman makes one thing very clear," she said calmly. "He doesn't believe in alternatives because he doesn't look for them." She leaned forward slightly, not to lean in emotionally, but to reframe the entire room. The way a teacher does when they're about to dismantle a flawed question, not out of spite, but to show there's more than one way to answer it. Why not build battery recycling centers in Detroit, she asked, instead of digging new holes in Alaska? She let the question sit for a second, not rhetorical, but real. It wasn't a hypothetical, it was a roadmap. We're sitting here debating whether we have to choose between child labor abroad or fossil fuel dependency at home. And the truth is, that's a trap, a deliberately narrow frame designed to box us into the same bad decisions we've been making for decades. Now she turned the page in front of her and began listing, not theories, not ideals, but policy. There's already legislation on the table that would provide tax credits to companies that establish lithium and cobalt recycling plants in former industrial corridors, places like Flint, Youngstown, and Gary. Towns with trained labor, built infrastructure, and populations hungry for long-term employment. She held up a document, the proposed Critical Materials Recovery Act. Instead of extracting raw material, we extract value from what we already have. Millions of batteries from phones, laptops, hybrid cars, none of it going to landfills. All of it feeding domestic supply chains. Her tone sharpened, not louder but clearer. You want energy security? Build it in communities that were gutted by outsourcing. Create new industry that doesn't rely on the suffering of children halfway across the world. That's how you break dependence on foreign supply chains, not by deregulating wilderness protections. The room was listening again, not just to her words, but to the structure of her logic. Because unlike Roy's narrative, hers didn't rely on fear. It relied on investment, on building forward instead of digging back. And when it comes to domestic mining, she continued, no one's saying never. What we're saying is, let's do it responsibly, with enforceable environmental standards, with transparent ownership structures, with labor protections, and with full consultation from indigenous communities who've spent generations defending these lands. She flipped to another chart, a breakdown of land use proposals in Alaska's Ambler region, overlaid with protected wildlife corridors and ancestral territories. If we're serious about stewardship, about protecting what we claim to value, then why is it easier to approve a strip mine than a recycling facility? She let that question settle too. The truth is, it's not about what's possible, it's about what's prioritized. If we can subsidize oil companies to drill through permafrost, we can subsidize clean tech companies to hire union workers in Michigan. Her voice stayed calm to the end. We have the means. We have the labor. What we need is the political will to redraw the lines, to stop pretending progress is an either-or, and start designing policy like we actually believe in the future. And just like that, the lines that Roy had drawn so neatly, jobs or climate, kids or energy, blurred. Because once people saw the third path, it was impossible to unsee. And that was what scared them most. He didn't have a real counter. That was clear. His script had been built on the assumption that she would be abstract, aspirational, easily dismissed as too idealistic for the real world. But now she'd laid out infrastructure plans, tax frameworks, workforce solutions, and land use standards. And the illusion that she was just the voice of the left had cracked. So he did what most cornered arguments do. He sputtered. It's not that easy, Roy said, his voice suddenly higher pitched, the confidence cracking just slightly beneath the surface. We can't just recycle our way out of this. We can't turn Flint into the next Silicon Valley overnight. There's a process. There's limits. She didn't move, but her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in that quiet, unmistakable way people do when they've heard that exact phrase one too many times. It's not that easy, it was always the fallback, the shrug of the powerful, the political version of a sigh. She leaned in, her voice steady, low at first. Of course it's not easy. Then louder, not raised but fuller. It's not supposed to be. A few heads turned. The tone had shifted again, not to outrage but to something firmer. Moral clarity. Doing the right thing has never been easy. That's the whole point. If it were easy, someone else would have done it by now. If it were easy, we wouldn't be sitting here debating whether our future should be built on the backs of children or the bones of the Arctic. She paused, not for effect, but to breathe. The kind of breath that reminded her why she'd come to Washington in the first place. Every time we propose something that disrupts the status quo, we're told to slow down, told to wait, told to be realistic. But realistic for whom? Realistic for the CEOs who profit from broken systems? Or for the parents watching their kids wheeze through another year of industrial asthma with no clinic in sight? Now the energy in the room began to shift, not with applause, not yet, but with focus. People were listening differently now, not to argue, not to react, but to absorb. You want to talk about limits? She continued. Let's talk about the limits we've placed on our own imagination, on our political courage, on our belief that we deserve more than two bad options. She leaned forward slightly, voice strong but still grounded. The truth is, we're not stuck between fossil fuels and foreign abuse. We're stuck between fear and responsibility. And I'm not here to defend fear. No one was nodding this time. No one was blinking. Even Roy had gone still. Because when you strip away the headlines, the talking points, the outrage theater, what you're left with is a choice. Not an easy one, but a necessary one. Do we build the future we need, or do we keep defending the failures of the past? Her voice softened, just slightly. That's the line I've redrawn today, and once you see it, you don't go back. She sat back in her chair. The room didn't move, because in that moment, for all the sound and fury that had come before, truth had echoed louder than fear. And no one, not even Chip Roy, could talk over it. There was no applause this time. No one dared to clap. The silence in the hearing room was different now. Not stunned, not awkward, but alert. Like everyone in the chamber had collectively leaned forward, whether physically or mentally, without even realizing it. Even the members who'd been half scrolling through their phones or shifting stacks of paper had gone still. Eyes up, hands paused. A few on Roy's side of the aisle sat with arms crossed, but their posture had changed. From resistance to attention. They weren't preparing to rebut anymore. They were listening. The chamber had shifted, not because anyone had won, but because AOC had managed to break through the noise. And that, in a room full of practiced performers, was no small thing. She could feel it. Not like an ego rush, nothing that cheap, but like standing in the eye of a storm you didn't cause, but finally learned how to walk through. Her voice hadn't cracked. Her facts hadn't wavered. And most importantly, her message had landed. She reached for her water glass without hurry, taking a small sip, eyes scanning the room without making a show of it. She didn't need to see faces of agreement. She wasn't here to win popularity. But she could tell something was different. They weren't reacting to her anymore. They were absorbing her. And beyond the four walls of the hearing room, the reaction had already started to surge. C-SPAN's live comment feed was flooded. She's not answering fear. She's replacing it with facts. This wasn't a debate. It was a reckoning. Never seen AOC more composed, more clear, more correct. That Fort Hood question? A direct hit. No comeback. This should be required civics class viewing. Hashtags like hashtag versus Roy, hashtag truth in session, and hashtag battery lie began climbing the Twitter trending bar within minutes. A clipped video of her saying, "Doing the right thing isn't supposed to be easy," was retweeted 80,000 times in less than an hour. Some of the retweets came from predictable corners, but others came from centrists, even a few conservative veterans and energy workers who, while still critical of EV policy, had clearly found her clarity impossible to dismiss. She didn't know any of this yet, not the numbers, not the algorithm. But she knew what it felt like when words landed, not as sound bites, but as structure, a reordering of how people saw the issue. Inside the Capitol Press Gallery, two reporters whispered back and forth, both adjusting headlines they thought they had already written. One of them deleted an opening sentence that had described Roy as the dominant voice in the room. Another quickly started drafting a piece with a new title. Ocasio-Cortez reframes the debate on EV ethics in American industry. And somewhere in a dim studio at a cable news station, a producer flagged the clip for segment priority. Not because of drama, but because it was substance that hit like drama, and that these days was gold. Even the House Majority Leader's press aide, sitting 3 rows back, typed something quickly into their notes and underlined it twice. She took control without raising her voice. That's what they weren't used to. In a chamber addicted to shouting matches and clever zingers, what AOC had done was speak without spectacle and still dominate the room. She didn't glance at Roy. She didn't need to. He was no longer the gravity in this conversation. That had shifted, and everyone knew it. Even the walls of the chamber, lined with portraits of long-dead men, seemed to lean in. Because something rare had happened. The room was still. The rhetoric had faded. The chamber finally listened. There was no applause this time. No one dared to clap. The silence in the hearing room was different now. Not stunned, not awkward, but alert. Like everyone in the chamber had collectively leaned forward, whether physically or mentally, without even realizing it. Even the members who'd been half scrolling through their phones or shifting stacks of paper had gone still. Eyes up, hands paused. A few on Roy's side of the aisle sat with arms crossed, but their posture had changed from resistance to attention. They weren't preparing to rebut anymore. They were listening. The chamber had shifted, not because anyone had won, but because AOC had managed to break through the noise. And that, in a room full of practiced performers, was no small thing. She could feel it, not like an ego rush, nothing that cheap, but like standing in the eye of a storm you didn't cause, but finally learned how to walk through. Her voice hadn't cracked, her facts hadn't wavered, and most importantly, her message had landed. She reached for her water glass without hurry, taking a small sip, eyes scanning the room without making a show of it. She didn't need to see faces of agreement. She wasn't here to win popularity, but she could tell something was different. They weren't reacting to her anymore. They were absorbing her, and beyond the 4 walls of the hearing room, the reaction had already started to surge. C-SPAN's live comment feed was flooded. She's not answering fear. She's replacing it with facts. This wasn't a debate. It was a reckoning. Never seen AOC more composed, more clear, more correct. That Fort Hood question? A direct hit. No comeback. This should be required civics class viewing. Hashtags like hashtag AOCB's Roy, hashtag Truth in Session, and hashtag Battery Lie began climbing the Twitter trending bar within minutes. A clipped video of her saying, "Doing the right thing isn't supposed to be easy," was retweeted 80,000 times in less than an hour. Some of the retweets came from predictable corners, but others came from centrists, even a few conservative veterans and energy workers who, while still critical of EV policy, had clearly found her clarity impossible to dismiss. She didn't know any of this yet, not the numbers, not the algorithm, but she knew what it felt like when words landed, not as sound bites, but as structure, a reordering of how people saw the issue. Inside the Capitol Press Gallery, 2 reporters whispered back and forth, both adjusting headlines they thought they had already written. One of them deleted an opening sentence that had described Roy as the dominant voice in the room. Another quickly started drafting a piece with a new title. Ocasio-Cortez reframes the debate on EV ethics and American industry. And somewhere in a dim studio at a cable news station, a producer flagged the clip for segment priority. Not because of drama, but because it was substance that hit like drama, and that, these days, was gold. Even the House Majority Leader's press aide, sitting 3 rows back, typed something quickly into their notes and underlined it twice. She took control without raising her voice. That's what they weren't used to. In a chamber addicted to shouting matches and clever zingers, what AOC had done was speak without spectacle and still dominate the room. She didn't glance at Roy. She didn't need to. He was no longer the gravity in this conversation. That had shifted, and everyone knew it. Even the walls of the chamber, lined with portraits of long-dead men, seemed to lean in, because something rare had happened. The room was still. The rhetoric had faded. The chamber finally listened. The silence lingered just long enough to leave a mark. And then AOC leaned back toward her microphone. But this time, she wasn't offering a metaphor or posing a moral dilemma. This time, it was about putting names on paper and facts on the record. "Madam Chair," she said, her voice steady and unhurried, "I'd like to enter several items into the official record." She tapped the manila folder in front of her. It was thick, not theatrically so, not bloated, but full. Dense with documents that most people in the room had never seen, and some had hoped never would. These include investigative reports, financial disclosures, and whistleblower statements regarding U.S.-based energy firms currently benefiting from mineral deregulation policies backed by members of this committee. A staffer walked the folder over to the clerk. Cameras adjusted, pens stopped. No one interrupted, not even Roy. They could feel what was coming next. AOC didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't even need to look around the room. All she needed was the microphone and the truth. Let's begin with AmeriCorps Minerals, LLC, she said. Founded in 2015, it's received over $18 million in tax subsidies over the past 4 years for lithium extraction on federal lands in Utah. Their primary investor? Cross Ridge Capital, a firm chaired by Thomas E. Riggins, a known donor to 3 sitting members of this committee. No reactions yet, just the low hum of discomfort. Next, Dakota Rare Earths Incorporated, currently operating with minimal environmental oversight in western South Dakota, thanks to amendments passed in the Infrastructure Acceleration Act, legislation co-sponsored by Representative Mallory Kern. Coincidentally, Dakota Rare Earths made maxed-out campaign contributions to Kern's pass in the same month the bill cleared subcommittee. Now heads began to turn. Some leaned away slightly from the committee table, others scribbled with more urgency than before. Roy's jaw was set but unmoving, his hands clasped tightly together. Third, Hydra Prospecting USA, a subsidiary registered in Delaware, but 80% owned by a holding company based in the Cayman Islands. That company, in turn, was revealed, through recent leaked filings, to have financial ties to a joint venture with Sino Global Tech Mining. She paused deliberately before continuing. Yes, that's a Chinese-owned operation, currently holding mineral leases in Texas. That line echoed. It hit hard, and not because it was new, but because it confirmed what had been whispered and half-reported for months. The very companies that had been propped up as American alternatives to foreign dependence were in fact vehicles for foreign capital dressed in red, white, and blue branding. Every one of these entities is either currently active or awaiting expansion permits under legislation written or co-authored by this chamber, she continued. That's not conjecture. That's not theory. That's your names on these documents. The weight of that landed like a gavel, not the kind that marks the start of debate, but the kind that signals judgment has been passed. She didn't call it corruption. She didn't need to. The facts spoke clearly, and the names attached to them were impossible to ignore. I am not accusing anyone here of illegal behavior, she said, her tone careful but clear. I'm pointing out a pattern, a system in which concern for American jobs is used to shield exploitation, profit, and geopolitical hypocrisy. And then, looking directly ahead, not at Roy, but through him, she added, if we're serious about reform, we can't keep pretending the rot is somewhere else. It's right here, and I will not let it be erased from the record. She sat back, not triumphant, just resolute. And for a long moment, no one said a word. Because when truth enters the record, labeled, documented, undeniable, it doesn't shout. It lingers, it stains, and it changes everything. As the documents were entered into the record, and the weight of her words settled across the room like morning fog, AOC opened the last folder in front of her. This one not for the committee, not for the press, not for anyone else. Inside was a photo, slightly bent at the corners, faded from years of moving between offices and hearings and late-night prep sessions. It was her abuela, arms wrapped tight around a toddler wearing a too big pink dress and mismatched shoes. Her. AOC held it gently, not to display it, but to remember why she ever picked up a mic in the first place. She took a breath, deeper than the rest, her voice softer now, not tired but tender. Madam Chair, she began, fingers brushing the edge of the photo. I have one more statement for the record, not a statistic, not a headline, a truth. She looked up, eyes clear. When my abuela came here, she cleaned floors for buildings like this one. She never sat behind a nameplate. She never filed a motion. But she taught me something Congress too often forgets, that survival is not the same as dignity, and dignity should never be traded for convenience. The chamber stayed still. No shuffling papers, no phones. This isn't just legislation. This is legacy. Her voice cracked slightly, not from weakness, but from the gravity of holding too many generations in one sentence. She did not wipe her eyes. She did not apologize. She simply folded the photo back into the folder, spine straight. Because in that moment, surrounded by cameras and critics and quiet allies, she wasn't just a congresswoman from the Bronx. She was every girl who ever watched her grandmother work in silence and decided silence would end with her. The chair had barely acknowledged the conclusion of her remarks when Chip Roy lunged at the mic one last time. Not physically, but rhetorically. His pride wouldn't let silence have the last word. His voice carried the sharp edge of someone who had been backed into a corner and needed to claw his way out. "It's a lovely speech, Congresswoman," he said, sardonic smile barely masked beneath his drawl. "But at the end of the day, it's still a fantasy. We don't live in some green utopia. We live in the real world. And in the real world, people need fuel, jobs, and trucks that run." Some murmurs of agreement floated in from his side of the aisle, but they sounded thinner now, almost rehearsed. The room had changed, and he could feel it. AOC didn't flinch, didn't look down. She leaned in with a calm that wasn't performative, but practiced, worn in like truth that had been carried a long, hard road. "If the future is a fantasy," she said, locking eyes with him, "then let me be the one who imagines it into reality." There was no spike in her voice, no exclamation point, just gravity, a statement planted like stone. She didn't need to win the moment. She had already moved beyond it. She gathered her notes slowly, tucked the photo of her abuela gently back into the folder, and rose from her seat. Not hurried, not triumphant, just certain. As she stepped out from behind the desk and began walking toward the exit, the cameras followed, not like prey, but like history recognizing a pivot. She didn't look back, because people who shift the course of debate don't chase applause. They walk like generals after the battlefield has already begun to turn. By the time Alexandria stepped onto the Capitol steps, the hearing clip had already begun making its way around the internet. Within an hour, one headline read, "AOC drops moral hammer on cobalt debate." Another, "The Cobalt Reckoning." Someone turned her final line, "If the future is a fantasy, let me be the one who imagines it into reality," into a t-shirt graphic before she even got back to her office. But it wasn't the virality that moved her, it was what came next. The emails, the voicemails, the handwritten notes dropped off at district offices. A mother in El Paso wrote, "My son has asthma too. We used to think it was just the dust from the desert. Now I wonder what else they've been dumping." A retired Navy mechanic from Buffalo said, "I didn't vote for you, Congresswoman, but you made me sit up. That means something." From a small mining town in Arizona, a union member signed only as Rick H. wrote in black ink on lined yellow paper, "You're not wrong. We can dig better. We can be better. Thanks for saying what we weren't allowed to." Even a high school senior from rural Kansas emailed, "I used to think politics was just noise, but you made it feel like someone was listening to us." The hearing chamber had been a battlefront, but beyond those walls, something softer and stronger was blooming. Connection, clarity, and the quiet courage of people beginning to believe that integrity could still cut through the fog. For Alexandria, this wasn't just a win, it was a reminder. The work didn't end at the mic. It echoed in the people who heard it. The screen fades to scenes not of Washington, but of places where decisions land hardest. A rust-colored town in West Virginia, where coal dust still clings to windowsills. A stretch of desert in Arizona scarred by unregulated drilling. A row of crumbling apartment buildings in the Bronx where kids chase each other across cracked concrete painted with hopscotch lines long faded. And over it, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez speaks, not with podium power, but with the softness of someone remembering who she's fighting for. "They told us we had to choose. Choose between clean air or honest work, between saving the earth or saving jobs, between dignity and survival." A shot of an older man hosing soot off a porch, a young woman welding solar panels on a Detroit rooftop, A boy running barefoot through a park reborn from a former dump. They lied. The real choice has never been between good jobs and green futures. The real choice has always been between convenience and courage, between clinging to what's easy or building what's right. The images turn now to faces: brown, white, black, hands calloused, arms inked with union logos, eyes fixed on something beyond the camera. Then finally, a slow pan across children gathered in a classroom planting seeds in soil cups by a windowsill, laughing as they spill water, as the teacher quietly reminds them, "It's okay. Growth is messy." AOC's voice, one last time. "To the ones who will inherit the earth, we hear you, and we fight not just so you'll live, but so you'll live well." This story reminds us that true leadership isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about standing tallest when it matters most. AOC didn't just debate, she revealed. She showed that clarity, courage, and truth can pierce even the thickest political fog. Her voice wasn't just hers. It echoed generations before her and spoke to those still unheard. In a world full of sound bites and spin, moments like these remind us what public service should look like: principled, personal, and powerful. Maybe the real question isn't whether AOC won the exchange, but whether we're finally ready to listen when someone speaks with both facts and fire. What would you stand up for, even if your voice shook? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.